Well, welcome everyone to Foreign Policy Discussion Group, and we're now in our 23rd year of bringing really recognized, terrific speakers right here in Chappaqua on speaking on a timely analysis of world events and challenges to U.S. policy. So, online with me and other members of the Foreign Policy Discussion Group are Tyler Beebe. Maybe just wave. Tyler, Amy Friedman, Naomi Marrow, Carolyn Resnick, and Peter Russell. So this is our group. We work very hard on finding great speakers and also topics that are really important or in the news and people want to know more about. So today is no exception. So for the past few months, we've all been tied up with what's going to happen on the election on foreign policy has been somewhat of a guessing game. Well, the election is now over and we know what the outcome is. And we are now seeing also through Trump's appointments how he tends to put in place people whose backgrounds reflect the promises that he made during his campaign. And that's including US involvement in Europe, quickly negotiating and ending the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, and allowing him to focus then on China. So it's very fortuitous that we have with us as our first speaker since the election, one of the most respected experts on US-China relations, and that is David Lampton from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, who's going to discuss what he expects our relationship with China to look like under Trump. So our format will be a little bit different than our usual. Professor Lampton will be speaking for just a few minutes before turning to an interview format with our host, Tyler Beebe. We will then continue with questions from panelists and from you, our viewers. Please enter your question into the chat tab at the bottom of the screen so I can read them to David. And as you know, our program is being recorded and it's archived on the Chappaqua Library website under Events and Foreign Policy. So now let me turn over the program to Tyler Beebe to introduce our guest.
Thanks, June. Thanks. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. As we all know only too well these days, U.S. relations with China during Xi Jinping's regime have been increasingly fraught on both the economic and the global political fronts. Our recent election, as June just mentioned, has thrown a big complicating factor into the mix with an intriguing range of possible outcomes, some of them more than a bit worrisome. To provide perspective on these new elements while still focusing on Xi Jinping's long-term game plan, we're very fortunate, as June mentioned, to welcome a China expert, Dr. David Lampton, as our speaker. David is Professor Emeritus, again, June mentioned this, and the former Director of China Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Earlier, he was the president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and later served as chairman of the Asia Foundation before working as a fellow at Stanford's Asia Pacific Research Center. He's the author of several books. In fact, I'm told he's written at least 10, including one, The Three Faces of Chinese Power, Might, Money, and Minds, and his most recent book, published just earlier this year, called Living U.S.-China Relations from Cold War to Cold War. David has written extensively for publications including Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and China Quarterly, to name just a few. And clearly, at least from what we can gather, David is very partial to California's very benign climate. He sports 3 degrees, a BA, an MA, and a PhD, all from Stanford, located in sunny Palo Alto. So away we go, and I look forward to interviewing David with a Q&A dialogue. And I'm now going to turn it over to David and thank him very, very much for taking the time to join us today. So, David, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Tyler, and I want to thank Joan Kuhn for all the behind the scenes work getting me here. And thank you, the Foreign Policy Group, for inviting me, giving me the opportunity to talk about my favorite subject. So I look forward to the Q&A with Tyler and the broader Q&A with the audience thereafter. Anyway, this sunny, at least in Washington, sunny Monday morning, we meet in a specific context, and that is that most immediately, President Biden and Xi Jinping got together over the weekend on Saturday, in this case in Lima, Peru, to talk. And it was sort of, I guess you would say, President Biden's swan song before exiting the presidency. And it was Xi Jinping's opportunity to lay down a few what he might consider markers for the new administration. So I think this meeting was Biden talking to Xi, but Xi, in a sense, talking to Trump. So it raises the interesting question of what I think Xi's message was. And he used two phrases that might not be, immediately apparent, the historical resonance, but he told Biden to, quote, make wise choices. And if you go back in history, when I entered this field in 1978 and 79, the United States under President Carter began the process of normalizing relations. And at that point, President Carter told essentially Mao Zedong and Premier Zhou Enlai to make wise choices. And Carter came back and said, I've made my choice. We're going to move to take the risks to normalize relations with the People's Republic of China. And that wise choice led to 40 years of what now is called engagement. And that led to a lot of positive outcomes, as well as over time, it created some serious problems for the United States and others as well. So in any case, the conversation over the weekend, Xi enjoined Trump to, in effect, as had been done earlier with Carter, to make wise choices. And those wise choices reflect in two areas: trade policy and Taiwan policy. So in a sense, what Xi was saying to Trump is make the right choice on Taiwan and make the right choice on trade, and we can deal with other things as they come along. So I think that was essentially the message there. Now, I think the second thing to say is that what Xi was saying to Trump is you've got to manage this relationship very carefully. And I was just in China, and this brings me to the messages I was given in China. I went to 5 cities in a couple of weeks ago in China, ended up in Beijing, where we had a high-level dialogue with the party officials that are responsible for foreign, or some of them that are responsible for foreign affairs. And I think they were simply saying the one issue that can get the United States and China into a war is Taiwan. Don't make a mistake there. And secondly, I think the Chinese message there, as Xi Jinping was talking to Biden, same message is that we're economically interdependent and don't make a big mistake and get a trade war going on, a trade war between the United States and China. So I guess what I would say is the message I was given in China and the people I was with was really the same as I think Xi was delivering to Biden in Lima, Peru, just over the weekend. Now, it seems to me the issue has arisen for the Chinese. How do we deal with Donald Trump? That's their overwhelming issue. And I think they have a 3-part game plan. One is to stimulate their own economy. That is, dump in a lot of money. The government's going to print a lot of money to keep its export economy going and its domestic demand up, no matter what Trump does by way of economic threat. Now, whether China can do that, what the consequences to the world economy of all this would be, whether it'll set off inflation, these are all very good questions, but the Chinese are trying to Trump-proof their economy as best they can, and that's not so easy, given the America is one of the biggest trade partners of China, and incidentally, China is one of the biggest trade partners of the United States. Second thing is that China wants to make friends. Now, of course, many of the policies that it implements don't, in fact, make itself friends, but it's trying. And you'll see now President Xi and the Foreign Minister Wang Yi and all the top officials are going all over to the middle powers like France and Britain and Japan, trying to win them over, separate them from the United States. So the United States has to moderate its policy if it doesn't want to be isolated from its own friends. So Chinese game plan is stimulate the economy and woo American allies and friends away from the United States. Now, of course, all of these middle countries have their worries about China too, so it's not so easy for them. Now, the question, it seems to me, is how do we Americans think about managing this situation? And it seems to me that maybe we could think about four things, and this is where I'll end my remarks, is that, first of all, remember we had 40 years of engagement from really President Nixon and President Carter, all the way through 8 presidents, up through at least into the Obama administration. Engagement produced more benefits, I think, than costs for the United States and indeed much of the rest of the world. Unfortunately, there were a lot of downsides in achieving those gains, but all I'm saying is, as we look in a sober fashion at the pluses and minuses, don't forget there were pluses to engagement, because if we say engagement was just a big mistake for 40 years, of course, we will then sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. And if you want in questions, we can certainly talk about what some of those gains were. Second thing is that the U.S.-China relationship, from my point of view, and I talk about it in that book, Living U.S.-China Relations, it's easy to think of it as just a state-to-state relationship, between two governments and militaries and intelligence communities and so on. But the U.S.-China relationship is really a society-to-society relationship, and churches and localities and states and companies and individuals in both of our countries have developed a thick network of, in many cases, mutually beneficial ties. So the real trick here, it seems to me, is how can we manage the state-to-state relationship in a way that still permits us to make some of the gains at the other levels of the relationship? How can we get cooperation on global climate change? How do we get cooperation on international health and so on? Certainly, a third thing to keep in mind is, as passionately as many and maybe all Americans feel about China and some of the things that it has, trade imbalances and human rights issues, many things to be very critical about, we have to remember that our allies and friends in Southeast Asia and Asia, they're all a lot closer to China, and they don't necessarily share all of our concerns, or if they do, not to the degree that we do. And the point I'm making is our allies are not going to follow us over a cliff if we mismanage the trade situation or the Taiwan situation. Our allies agree with us on some things and not with other things. And so we've got to take into account what other people in the world think about how we manage the U.S.-China relationship. And then finally, I would just end with this part with the somber thought that the subtitle of my book is From Cold War to Cold War, and that's partly because it's biographical. The book's biographical, and I was born in 1946, and the Cold War was just almost ready to be launched, so to speak. And as I move towards the end of my career, now I'm sort of in what appears to me to be, in many respects, not all respects, a new Cold War. But the book is about the in between for the most part and how we got out of the first Cold War and how we're getting into what arguably you could call a second Cold War. So I think, Tyler, I hope I haven't gone on too long, but that's sort of what I had on my mind.
Well, David, thank you. Some interesting perspectives that I think give us a little more balanced view of our connections with China. Okay, well, why don't we launch into question number one? And this is not an easy one because it covers the waterfront plus some, but getting a little more specific and drilling down more on the range of implications that the Trump administration is likely or could possibly have on our relations with China. Why don't you give us, just to make it a little more dramatic, some of the best possible cases and the worst possible cases you could dream up on the economic, on the geopolitical front, and on the front of our relations with Taiwan, meaning if Trump behaves perhaps bordering on irrationally and aggressively, what are the worst possible scenarios that you could dream up, for example, starting on the trade front?
Well, there are infinite number of possibilities, and I do
Sure.
believe in huge human agency. I believe leaders matter. Uh, they're not the only thing. There are huge global forces like globalization and the during globalization, we got huge income growth for many people around the world, but we also had some people that really lost all over the world in globalization, and they are becoming forces of populism, and leaders are having to, respond to this sense of grievance and loss on important parts of their population. So the point is that I believe both in leaders and grand historical forces. So it is an important thing to me that we have a Trump versus any number of alternatives. It was important that we had Biden, and that when he was elected, there were alternatives. At every stage, we've had alternatives, and no one has found it easy to manage the relationship. So I'm not here to tell you there's a silver bullet and I know it, and all we need is a wise person to pursue it. But you've asked me what are the worst and best case scenarios. I would say the worst case scenario is that the United States mismanages the Taiwan situation, and that's a whole story because we don't completely control what Taiwan or anybody else does. But if we go back on the arrangements that we had with China under President Nixon and then later President Carter, what's called the three communiques, the one China policy, if China comes to see us as having violated the core proposition that there's one China, without defining what that is too much, I think that's the one issue that almost certainly would cause war. And what bothers me about several things is Trump sort of like a poker player. He's got different hands he can put together out of different cards, and you're not quite clear which things he's prioritizing. But in the past, he has said Taiwan, this is my phraseology, isn't that important to me? But trade's really important. So if you, China, give me something on trade, maybe I'll give you something on China. And this leads China to wonder exactly how committed is Trump to Taiwan's security. He
Sure.
has said Taiwan doesn't pay enough for its security. He has said that Taiwan has stolen the chip industry from the United States. So he has an attitude towards Taiwan that might suggest to the Chinese he's not that committed as past presidents have been. And if China says, well, maybe this is the moment to strike, he is preoccupied with all these problems at home. He's got a war with Ukraine and all that. Maybe his attention span is too diffuse. He's got all these domestic problems. He has other foreign problems. He doesn't care that much about Taiwan. So there are a million ways this could unwind, but worst case scenario one is that somehow we both misjudge on Taiwan, and Trump has made it easier than I would feel comfortable with, drawing into question his commitment there. So that's just, you asked for the sort of the worst case. On the trade side, tariffs. You remember back, I think it was 1931, Smoot-Hawley tariffs really plunged from already a depression to a deep depression. Tariffs, we have experience with tariffs, and they slowed the global economy. That's why after the Depression and World War II, we created the World Bank and the IMF to make sure that we had freer trade and not tariffs and not trade barriers. Now, so of course, China all along hasn't been exactly a free trader. I'll be the first to concede that. But Trump is absolutely, as a matter of global policy, not to mention China, is a believer in tariffs. And he's sold it as the idea is that the Chinese will pay the tariffs. Therefore, if we put tariffs on, we're punishing the Chinese, which a lot of people would like to do. But the fact is, it's a sales tax on Americans. So the people who, in lower income that shop at Walmart or Target and so forth, they're going to face higher goods, which translates to inflationary pressure for Americans. We've already seen that in the tariffs Trump put on in the first time. So, but the Chinese are not going to be turn the other cheek on tariffs. They've got a million ways, including tariffs, to retaliate, and they will. And I'm not saying we should, quote, be afraid, but the point is, it is illusory to think that China will not throw up more trade barriers. And that will stimulate not only us, but Europeans and others to throw up trade barriers against China. And we're going to step ourselves into a real deflation in the global economy. So I think those are the kind of two worst things immediately. Best case analysis, I think it's going to, well, first of all, it's going to, on even the best possible case, we've got so many problems with China and China with us that we're just going to have to work through this, and it's going to take a long time. I don't think there is a grand bargain that leads to, happy days are here again anytime soon. But, oh dear, my picture went away here. Let me, suddenly it went away. Somehow this is timed here.
You're still here. We still see
Can you hear?
We see and
Yeah,
hear you.
we can see and hear you. Yep.
Oh, good.
Yep.
Let me just get my thing back on because it does something sometimes.
It's got a mind of its own, right?
Yes, this computer just won't let me stay on more than an hour on Zoom. I don't know why that is. But in any case, those are the sort of worst case analysis. The best is that it's going to take a long time to work through. But I think what we're going to have to do is go back to the promises that Nixon and Carter made the Chinese that we will not support the independence of Taiwan. This is painful for many Americans. They feel a commitment to our democratic friends in Taiwan and so on. But we simply are too far removed with too many commitments to fight a war 95 miles off China's. And the island will be destroyed if we do. So I think we got to get realistic about what our capabilities on Taiwan are. And I think if we got realistic on that, we could begin to improve on the other fronts. The the other thing is that we do not go down the throwing up tariff route too severely, at least. And that most importantly, we have to conclude, both of us. Right now, we both have said to the other, this is, you are the most, I'm trying to get, now I've lost that picture again.
You're still fine. We still see you.
Okay,
Yeah,
I guess I'm just going to have to forget the picture.
Maybe if you moved your mouse, if you have a mouse, it might have
Yeah.
gotten off the Zoom screen.
There I am.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you. So anyway, I think get trade straightened around, get Taiwan straightened around, and then strategically, we need to say each of our countries has a bigger problem than each other. Right now, all our strategic documents say in both countries, effectively, each of us is the other's biggest security problem and threat to our values. And so you can see why I think it's going to take a long time, but essentially, Taiwan manage trade and don't make each other our principal strategic problem. Now that's all easier said and done than done. So that's why I'm a little worried. We've got a president that's so preoccupied, and naturally so, with the domestic problems he's facing, and then other problems in the world, that we will mismanage the situation with China.
yeah. Well, good. Thank you. That's a very broad scoped answer to the question. Let's zero in specifically, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
on some of the personalities that we're going to be, or that when I say we, that China and the U.S. will be involved with, assuming that Trump's appointments actually get approved, or most of them will. Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State. Do you have any? He's a hawk on China. He's made that very clear. Due to his past actions and comments, he's actually, as you know, banned from traveling to China at the moment, which is kind of a bizarre situation, given that he's certainly someone you would think would want to go to China eventually at some point. So I wonder what your thoughts are on Rubio, and then I'll throw in the other two names that are could be meaningful. Mike Waltz as the National Security Advisor clearly is a hawk as well on China, and he will have probably a lot to say about our approach to that country. And then finally, Pete Hegseth. Now, we're not totally confident, I guess, that he is going to be approved, given some issues that have come up. But he too is a flaming hawk on China based on his past comments. So I just wonder what your take on those three people might be. And of course, it's early days and we don't even know if they will be the players, but it looks like they will be.
Right. Well, your questions are leading me into the zone of opinion, right? And
Yeah, that's fine.
I'm
That's
glad to
okay.
share my opinions, but I want you
Good.
to know that I do believe there's opinion and fact, and then there's a lot of gray out there.
Oh,
So
yeah. Yeah.
I'm really not an ideologue or a partisan, but your question I will answer forwardly. First of all, people don't sometimes act differently in office than before. So you got to keep that as a possibility. But I would
Sure.
say the three that you've mentioned, and I'll pay the most attention to Rubio. Yes, well, first of all, I share your anxiety. So that's the sort of bottom line there. It surely is true that it would be unusual to have a Secretary of State who our major strategic concern will not allow in the country. That's a big problem when your Secretary of State can't talk to the other leadership. Now, of course, in this day and age, you don't have to travel to talk, but I'm a believer getting together and understanding each other and looking each other in the eyeballs still counts for a lot. So I think that you point to a practical problem. whether the Chinese would lift that sanction because they believe in person-to-person contact too. I can't say what Beijing would do, but that's a big problem. If I try to put my China, how do the Chinese look at a Rubio appointment? I guess they would say they see a fierce anti-communist, partly, I suppose, because of his Cuban background and appreciation of America and its political system and his intrinsic anti-communism. He's also, the Chinese are tired of being pushed around on human rights. And of course, they Chinese can point to a lot of things the US has done in their view on human rights. So why do you criticize China all the time? So Rubio would, I don't know that the Chinese, I don't think they're surprised, but it certainly isn't a choice that they would have made, or even there'd probably be a lot of other candidates that they would rather have to deal with. So I don't think there's a big surprise there, but it isn't going to facilitate smooth communication. Let's put it that way. Um, the other two walls, I have less of a sense of. I don't disagree with your characterization. And Hegseth, of course, the Chinese will look at. We have Hegseth and Fox News, and they've got a long experience with Fox News and their policy line on China. So that will not be comforting either. So I guess the point is that the Chinese wouldn't be surprised, but this will not lead them to think that Trump has got a lineup with which it will be easy to deal with. This will raise their antibodies. Let's put it this way. Let me put it a different way. When I was in China and we were speaking in Beijing to the foreign policy leaders that we spoke with, they said basically, whoever you, meaning the United States, chooses president is your business. We don't, and by implication, the other people that a president would appoint, that's your business. What we care about is not personalities, we care about policy. And we're worried about the policy direction here. They also, incidentally, had worries about the Democratic. So it wasn't like, but I think on balance, the people that I talked to probably would have marginally hoped for the other ticket to win. Did not happen. As far as I know, they didn't really do anything in pursuit of their desires, as the Russians apparently did. But in any case, this is certainly not their preferred outcome. And they tried to summarize the dilemma is Trump seems of two minds. He surrounds himself with warriors, tough hardliners. And on the other hand, he keeps talking about trading and making a deal. Well, who in his administration is going to win? Is it the warriors or the traders? So I think, I don't think I can say more about it at this point. And you're right to observe maybe some of the, well, I think the people you've mentioned, my sense is that those probably will not be where the Donnybrook over confirmation happens. I may be wrong about that. There are other nominees that seem to be exciting Congress more. But in any case, I think the Chinese don't care so much about personalities, care about policy. They're worried about the policy, and they're going to stay tuned, but they're planning, as I said in my opening remarks, for a tough policy.
Good, thanks. Let's proceed to Xi himself. Clearly, over the years, he seems to have become a more doctrinaire Communist Party adherent, sticking more rigidly to Communist Party, basics. And it's beginning to become very evident that he's become rather immovable, rather stuck in his ways. And I just wonder whether domestically, the average Chinese person on the street the average businessman, the bureaucrat, and the government and so forth is becoming a little disillusioned by the strictures of Xi's regime. The inflexibility, the adherence again to standard routine communist ideology. Is there any sense that there are really rumblings of disillusionment amongst Chinese society?
I think the answer is first, yes, there are indications of some disillusion, but China is a heterogeneous society. It has different groups. It's not always so easy for us to see, and we tend to hear from the party first of all, or intellectuals, people with access to the outside world who have some ability to express their views. So there are different views in China, and some are not as friendly to the U.S. or the West or globalization as others. So there, you can hear different views in China if you look hard enough across the board. But I would say intellectuals and the previously growing private sector in China are very unhappy because she represents a reassertion of intellectual media control, the surveillance society, and putting the party back in charge of economic enterprises. For a long time, private sector was growing dramatically, and some of China's biggest companies were were enterprises that were really not within the Communist Party's control. She came in and wanted to re-exert control over those firms. So I think you can say previously private sector, many people in, excuse me, people in the party and intellectuals are very unhappy. But on the other hand, you mentioned his ideology and so forth. I would say his ideology is not really communist, meaning Karl Marx, not that at all. It's more Lenin, who believed in a strong party, almost irrespective of ideology. So I think what she is all about the party running everything, not to make a communist utopia in the future, but to keep control domestically. So he's about control, not the communist nirvana. Also, he is mobilizing people in China, like Trump does here, who in many respects lost in globalization. Many people in the northeast of China, just like in the Midwest of the United States, manufacturing was hurt, and so forth. So I would say Trump is mobilizing a populist coalition, not entirely different in a way. I don't want to go too far with this, as
Mhm.
Trump. And so I think there are a lot of people in China, if they saw the way to ease him out, they'd try to do it. But right now, the party is what, 95 million people. It's bigger than most countries of the world. He's got technology that, surveillance capabilities greater than, I suppose have ever existed for any government anywhere at any time. So I don't, yes, there is discontent, but I don't see it spilling over. I would just add one last thing is, of course, how many revolutions have we missed until they were happened? So, our record on predicting turmoil isn't always terrific.
You're right. Very right. Yep. Okay, next question. Focusing a little more closely on the risk of something happening in Taiwan that is going to be difficult for everyone to deal with. China is clearly not happy with some of the new alliances over the last 5 or 10 years that we've gotten involved with in the Western Pacific, specifically the Quad, the AUKUS agreement with nuclear submarines, including the UK, and our much improved relations with the Philippines, who, as you know, have allowed us to open up some Air Force bases in the northern parts of the archipelago. So the Chinese are looking askance at these measures that we've taken, and they take them as being, frankly, rather aggressive. And I wonder whether, though, they are actually a pretty good deterrent against China taking any aggressive action on Taiwan.
Well, a lot of sub questions packed in there. But
Yeah.
first of all, you're right that China is worried about this new alphabet soup of different security arrangements, AUKUS with the U.S., UK, and Australia. Uh, there's the Quad that includes India, the United States, Japan. Um, so we're building a kind of alphabet soup. It's not quite alliances like during the first Cold War, but they're groupings and providing us access to pre-position materials, do training, create interoperability between different American friends and allies, militaries. So China sees quite clearly that the U.S. is trying to build a wall of what Xi Jinping referred to a little more than a year and a half ago, as the effort of the United States to contain and suppress China. So they see it as very hostile. And what they are doing is building their military budget. They now got the biggest navy by ship count of any navy in the world. They have the biggest army by personnel count in the world. China is now just in the last few weeks rolling out new generations of aircraft that are, I guess, in the ballpark. I'm not an expert on this, of the F-35. It's been sailing its aircraft carriers around and building, I think it's on its third carrier that it's building now. So the long and the short of it is they are convinced we are trying to contain and suppress them. And this containment and suppression, in their view, and I mean, it is happening, is complemented on the economic front. The U.S. has a concerted effort with the CHIPS Act on silicon chips to deny China the access to the most high-speed, most capable chips. And we're pressuring our allies around the world and economic friends not to sell this to China or the production machinery to make that kind of thing. And of course, the Chinese see that the United States is not only trying to keep their military down, but to the degree to which that kind of technology is the basis for future economic growth, AI, all of this, the Chinese see our security policy trying to strangle their access to technology and keep them poor. That's just exactly how the Chinese see this. So their view is that the United States is really trying to get its hands around China's security throat. Now, there's an American side of this story. And of course, the side of that story is leakage of our high technology. We've been worried about it, theft in many cases. That's one part of it. China is exporting and has such a huge trade surplus. It fuels China's ability to invest in the military. So that's a problem. We're worried about human rights in Xinjiang and Tibet and what's happened in Hong Kong. We look at the South China Sea and see China, just look in the paper today, Fiery Reef is given China a position, a base in the South China Sea that gives it the quickest response time to events in the South China Sea of any major power. So, the U.S. has a story here. I'm not just telling you the Chinese side. But the long and the short of it is, this is what leads each of us to say the other is the biggest challenge to our economic, military, and value future.
Yeah, thank you.
Did I get all your questions there, Tyler?
What's that?
Did I get all your questions in that one question?
I think so. Yeah, yeah. And we got a few more questions, so I should proceed without
Tyler,
yeah, slowing things down.
Tyler,
Uh,
I think we've got to let other panelists also ask questions too, because time is starting to get tight.
Yeah, okay, let me ask a few more. We do have well, we've got 27 minutes left to be precise. So let me ask one in terms of the South China Sea. Obviously, China's been very provocative in, directly, virtually attacking Philippine fishing boats and so forth. And they've generated an awful lot of ill will in the periphery of the South China Sea with Vietnam and other, peripheral countries, Indonesia and so forth, and obviously in the Philippines. My question is, why are they being so aggressive when in fact they don't really have to be? They've already established a military presence that's very convincing with their air bases in the South China Sea. So why proceed to be so provocative and confrontational? It mystifies me, and I wonder whether you've got a view on that.
Well, I guess a number of things, but I'll just make two because I know time's short. One is that I didn't hear in your list of possible reasons resources. And resources include fisheries, and which is
Sure.
a major source of protein for everybody in the area and indeed the world. And of course, mineral resources. And you've got nodules of rare metals and so forth in the South China Sea of at least unknown to me magnitude. But the way our industry, AI, computers, EVs, batteries are requiring more and more of strategic materials. So I think part of and China doesn't want to be dependent on any one source. So diversification is an important part of China's strategy, and resource diversification is certainly, I think, part of it. A second reason is, and I'm not trying to whitewash or apologize for China's policy. I'm just trying to describe it. So resources is one. Another is the strategic location of Southeast Asia. About what is it? About 70% of global trade goes through the Straits of Malacca and up to Japan and Korea and so forth, and particularly fuel and petrol from the Middle East and Persian Gulf. So there's a strategic aspect to all of that. Um, and also, I think the Chinese sort of view if we don't occupy the area, somebody else will. And that somebody else might be the United States. And China's very worried about getting contained in the first island chain there and wants to have avenues of escape from its long coast. But there's a ring of islands, all the way from Japan down to Philippines and so forth, Taiwan. So I think there are strategic reasons, resource reasons, diversification reasons.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think it is probably time to turn it over to questions from the panel. So why don't we proceed with that?
David, would you speak to Japan in this whole mix and how we can maximize our connection with them?
I couldn't hear too well, Naomi. Did you say how does Japan fit in this whole situation?
Basically, yeah. And how do we maximize our role with them to our advantage?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and I'm like everybody else trying to think it through. But Japan, since World War II, basically has relied very heavily on the United States for defense. And defense, of course, in the first Cold War met against both the Soviet Union and China. And I suppose, in some sense, in the first Cold War, the Soviets were the bigger worry at that time. But as China has grown, Japan always keeps its eye on China, and China always keeps its eye on Japan because of the invasion by Japan and the war of 1894 and 95, where China lost Taiwan to Japan. So the most problematic security relationship, one of the most in Asia now, is between China and Japan. And this is one thing that worries me about Trump. And as I say, I'm not trying to be a partisan here, but Trump and I agree with him. Grew up in the Vietnam War, and my uncle fought in Korea. So I'm not in favor of wars in Asia. But Trump is really not in favor of wars in Asia. So this leads Japan to say, in the past, the United States has guaranteed Japan's security. And we were willing to pay a lot of money to do that. In exchange, Japan said, we won't get nuclear weapons. We never wanted Japan to have nuclear weapons. But now, if Trump seems less committed to defending Korea, Japan, the Philippines, then everybody in the region's got to say to themselves, who's going to take care of us, including Taiwan? And the answer is, we got to take care of ourselves. And so if they're going to take care of themselves, what does that mean? It means spending more money. But depending on which country we're talking about, I mean, Taiwan cannot outspend China. Japan probably can't outspend China. And so they're going to begin to look for other ways to secure. And there are two ways they could do that: cut a deal and become more friendly with China. Well, we wouldn't particularly like that. Or get nuclear weapons and sort of go the route of Israel. We're small in a hostile sea of countries around us, so get nuclear weapons and take care of ourselves. But the U.S. has never wanted all these countries to have nuclear weapons. That strikes us as a totally uncontrollable circumstance. So this is where I think we need to look at what a Trump administration means. I applaud the idea we shouldn't have wars. But sometimes if you don't have a willingness to use the force you have, you then encourage people to do things that produce a war. So I think this is one of the big stories. How is Asia going to read Trump? Does he love trade more than freedom? Does that deal with your question?
Sadly, yes.
Yeah.
Tyler, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Staying on the security theme for a moment. I noticed in the press reports that President Biden and Mr. Xi also discussed the need to have a human hand on the nuclear question on both sides. I thought that was significant. Both of them commented on it.
Right.
And that leads me to a question, which is, should the U.S. be looking at China through security lens by itself, or should it be focusing more on how China is cooperating with Russia, North Korea, and Iran? Is it a main focus on China itself or on this notion of a bloc?
Well, two questions there. One on the human hand on the nuclear button. I think China is not very happy that North Korea has forged along with its nuclear program and missiles. After all, North Korea, when it tests weapons, is very close to China. So first of all, people in North China just don't like the idea of nuclear possession and testing anywhere in North Korea, because that's very close to China. So China has some very tangible reasons. Also, they don't want a nuclear war fought on the Korean Peninsula. And also, if North Korea gets nuclear weapons, then South Korea has more pressure. And if South Korea gets more pressure, then Japan's going to feel. So this just leads, and China doesn't want to be surrounded by a nuclear North Korea, South Korea, Japan, and then it has India down on the southern end of the situation, and it isn't even that happy that Pakistan has nuclear weapons. So if you just look around China wants as little proliferation as possible. Now you would be right in asking that, well, if that's so true, why have they supported some transfer of technology to these countries? So there's some contradiction here, but I think basically China would like less proliferation rather than more. And I think China, as one Chinese said to me about North Korea, says, with friends like the North Koreans, who needs enemies? Their idea with North Korea having its hand on the nuclear button is not a really reassuring idea, I think, to almost any Chinese leader or otherwise. So that's sort of how I'd tackle the first part of your question. Now, you asked about security lenses and Russia. I would say the security lens includes Russia and was more more concerning after the 2022 Winter Olympics. Remember, Putin went to the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics in 2002, and he surprised everyone by signing a partnership agreement without limits to cooperation, were the operative words. And this struck us as almost a security pact, like happened in 1950, just before the Korean War broke out. And Mao went to China, talked to Stalin, came back, and they had a pact. And, 6 months later, South Korea was invaded. And we always saw that pact as them cooperating to plan. Now, it's a complicated story. And I don't know that we had the story exactly right in 1950. But in any case, that cooperation between the Soviet Union and China led to aggression in 1950. And so now we see the Russians were threatening Ukraine before Putin went to Beijing. Xi Jinping and Putin agreed to an agreement, and bingo, 3 weeks later, Ukraine's invaded. So this was more confirmation in the minds of many in Washington, and not limited to Washington, that Putin and the strongmen of Asia were aligning against to support a war in the heart of Europe. So this is more a confirmation of all the other security lenses. It reinforced it. And that's why I think our relations have, whatever gradient you thought they were on 3 or 4 years ago, it's on a steeper downward slide, I think, really, than then. So I see the Russia thing as, in the minds of our decision makers, as just another step in the wrong direction, big wrong step. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks. Appreciate it.
Amy?
Sure. Thank you. Great talk. David, I appreciate how you laid everything out so clearly. I want to go back to the point you made before about this trade-off between trade and freedoms or human rights.
You have to get, I'd say your max is, we have.
Okay. And it seems to me for Trump, the be all and the end all for Trump is winning, right? He wants to be able to turn around and act as if he won, that he got something from the Chinese. And I think the Chinese have a much more sophisticated understanding of US politics than they did 8 years ago or 20 years ago. So I have to think Xi Jinping and his advisors understand this. So I wondered if you thought that there was something the Chinese could do that Trump could frame as a win. I don't think Trump cares two figs about liberty and democracy, and I genuinely worry that he doesn't care about Taiwan or South Korea or Japan, that he sees our relationships in a purely transactional dimension. So is there something that Xi Jinping could give that would be a win that might keep Trump at least marginally engaged to maintain some semblance of status quo in Asia?
I think there are probably two things that would. First of all, back to that Russia question just for a second. I think Washington would respond rather well if China began to put pressure on Russia to ease up. In other words, if we're going to put pressure on Ukraine to compromise, it'd be nice to have a partner that was pushing the Russians to compromise. And China is supplying a lot of dual use technology that the Chinese can or the Russians can use. And also, I don't think Putin wants to lose Xi is his only big power friend in the world, right? So I think one thing the Chinese could do is maybe behind the scenes or more openly put some pressure on Russia to compromise, whatever the content of that would be. That would be moving on the strategic, and then Trump could say, "Look, I at least got this open-ended Ukraine thing under control here." That's he said I was going to get it done in a day. It's hard to imagine how that happens. But that would be one thing. And then when Trump was in office the first time, just as Trump left office, they reached what was called the phase one trade deal. And China was going to buy, I think it was $200 billion worth of American goods. It ended up not buying much of all. And the Chinese could buy American farm goods, which would make everybody in the Middle West happy. And so I think if he had a combination of putting pressure on the Russians about Ukraine and going back to his phase one trade deal and buying $200 billion worth of stuff, my guess is Trump could find a way to make some political hay out of that. That's put crudely, but he has to do it without encouraging China to do something radical on Taiwan. I don't think China wants to get tied around the axle on Taiwan right now. That's my sense. So I would kind of do something on Russia if you're China. Go back to the trade deal and say, sorry, we didn't get it done the first time, but here it is now, let's move.
So, David, what do you think does China have a long game here? I mean, we're talking about sort of near future, but are they thinking the next phase down? Are they after, do they ultimately see themselves as wanting to be co-equal with the United States? Or are they looking for, I mean, do they want to amass more land? Where are they going?
Yeah. Well, of course, like I said, there are different Chinese that would answer that question differently, but Xi is the most important one. He has his hands on all of the key levers of power as far as we can see. So it's fair to ask, what's his game plan? There are others that, academics and think tank people or people that work in the Ministry of Commerce in China might look at it differently than the People's Liberation Army. So different views, but I think he just, remember, not too many years ago, extended the terms. There was a two-term limit rule for Chinese leaders, and he extended it to essentially unlimited. So he, unlike an American leader, is bounded by either 4 years or 8 years if they're lucky, and that's if Congress doesn't change and sort of politically weaken them along the way. So I think the United States has this problem of always having elections and then having people who will change tact, and so it's hard for us to have a long game when everybody's playing short-term politics. Xi is capable because he has control and he has longevity of a long game. So your question is, what is his vision of the long game? And I think it is economic terms to make China the hub of the Asian economy. As one Chinese said to me, you know, in the old days, all roads led to Rome. Well, in the future, all roads economically are going to lead to Beijing. I think that's, and in territorial terms, what does this mean? I think for Xi, it means restore China's boundaries to what they were at the height of the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty. So you look, roll out the map, and of course, at that point, a lot of people get worried because the Qing dynasty at its greatest was pretty expansive. And so, but I think the Chinese on that score have compromised over time with the Russians on their claims to Russia and on their claims to with Vietnam and elsewhere along the periphery of China. So I think the territorial demand, so to speak, is compromisable, except for Taiwan. But I think they have an economic vision as the hub of Asia and push its boundaries to the extent of the Qing dynasty to the degree that it can. Is that enough of an answer?
Yes, and I think as far as we can foresee, right? For now, who knows where
Sure.
we're going.
David, just
Thank you.
quickly-
I had
quickly-
one quick question.
Go
Thank you
ahead,
very much.
Carolyn.
This has been a marvelous morning. So wonderfully fluent and erudite on all these subjects, but that reminds me of what Poland's desires were for the Polish Empire, which is back to 1792. But other question, just in the totally other direction, what about the relationship between China and India? Any comments on that?
Yes. First of all, India, if the United States treats India as, what we're trying to do is get India to be in security terms, have a compatible strategy with us, which is to resist China. And of course, every impulse in Taiwan, in India, is to resist. And they have a border conflict in two places. There's called the Eastern sector and the Western sector. I won't go into it, but it's all up in the Himalayas. And this has been a long-standing conflict, and it has to do with that access into Tibet so the Chinese can maintain control of Tibet. And further, the Dalai Lama fled what we'll call Tibet in China and is now ensconced and has been since 1959 in northern India. So that relationship has its own territorial terms, religious terms, and so forth. So I don't think that's going to get solved anytime soon. Although the last few weeks, the Chinese have been talking with the Indians and trying to stabilize the border. So the Indians are really worried about the Chinese. But on the other hand, they are a civilization. They're not just a state. They're a civilization. Like China's a civilization. Certainly Russia is. Well, India is. And they don't want to be, just used by the Americans as a counterweight to China. So India has this kind of prickly quality. They're not happy with China, but they don't want to just be the tail on the American dog doing what Washington wants in security terms. So a perfect example of this is India needs oil. The US has sanctioned Russian exports of oil. India doesn't care and buys both, incidentally, from Russia and from Iran. So India is not just a tool of the US as much as we wish it would be, I suppose, in some sense. So, and also they have deeply ingrained problems with China, but it's up at, the Himalayas start really at 12,500 and go up. So it's very isolated area. And so I just think that what you can hope for is to get this relationship stabilized, but I don't think it's going to get resolved. And if the Americans have the idea the Indians are going to be this wonderful strategic counterweight to China, I don't think the Indians want to play that game.
Thank you.
David, could you give us a quick half minute at least on China's demographic problem? We were talking about India. India now surpasses China in population. China's population is gradually declining, probably a lot because of the disaster really of the one-child policy.
Right.
So any thoughts on how they counter that and conceivably reverse that trend?
Well, in terms of the demographics, you put your hand on I think one of the really, I always say you wouldn't want to be a Chinese leader. You never want to trade America's problems for China's. And I would start with the demographic. My first trip to China was 1976. I went with a steroid chemistry group. That's the active ingredient in birth control pills. So the first thing Mao dies, they invite in a birth control delegation on the chemistry of birth control. So you can, Mao's view was the more people you have, the stronger you are. That was, that's a kind of a traditional society view of power. But Deng Xiaoping came along and says, look at, if we want to raise the per capita income people in China, we have to have a better economy and we need fewer per capitas. So he had the one China policy or child policy with the idea of dramatically reducing the population, or at least slowing its growth so that per capita income could rise more rapidly, grow the economy, import technology, have fewer people, basically, or have not as many as you would have otherwise. Well, that led to all sorts of abuses we're familiar with, abortion and forced abortion and planned, literally keeping track of everybody's cycle in the month, and it was just a nightmare, huge pushback. So then, after Deng left the scene, but what had happened? You now have fewer working age people at the bottom of the pyramid and more older people at the top, which meant essentially young people had to work harder to support all of the retirement, because there's no retirement, there was at that time, no retirement system in China. So your family had to take care of it. So it meant 2 children essentially taking care of 4 grandchildren or grandparents and so forth. So anyway, that became unsustainable. And so now they have reverse policy again to have 2 or more children. Well, that will create problems too. But one of the big problems is women with more education and workplace opportunity and so on don't necessarily want to have maybe any children, or much less 3 children. And so you're finding China is below the replacement rate, even though the policy is to have more than 2 or more children. So I would say birth control, demography is one of the big problems, and productivity, and the total factor of productivity in China is going it's still positive, but it's going down, the rate of increase. So this is creating huge problems. Kids are deciding, maybe I don't want to get married.
Yeah.
But
Well, on that note, I think we've kind of reached our limit. And David, I want to, and we all want to thank you profusely for taking the time to join us today, for covering the waterfront, for raising some issues that in a lot of cases we weren't totally aware of. So thank you so much. And maybe we can do it again in the future.
well, I'd be glad to, and looks like your community is just great. Both got an active civic society and interested. That's really a pleasure to talk with you.
David, thank you so much. This really has been a pleasure, hearing your perspective on things. And I think being able to just sort of have a little bit of time just to get more details and understanding from what we can see in the press. So thank you very much. Let's see. So our next meeting will be Monday, December 2nd. It will be at 11 a.m. So please note that is a different time, 11 a.m. Our speaker will be Ryan Berg, who is director of the American Program and head of the Future of Venezuelan Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. His topic will be election theft in Venezuela. Can Maduro pull off the mother of all election frauds? So we look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you again on December 2nd at 11 a.m.